The winter of 2014 settled heavily over the quiet industrial town, covering everything in a blanket of lifeless gray. Streets were empty by evening, not because of crime or danger, but because nothing in the town was worth staying outside for. Factories closed early, cafes dimmed their lights, and the only building that seemed awake after midnight was Ravenscrest Psychiatric Hospital. The hospital stood on a small hill, tall and hollow like a forgotten monument. Its windows were narrow and tinted, its long hallways illuminated by buzzing fluorescent bulbs that flickered often enough for staff to joke that the building had a heartbeat of its own. The locals knew the place, spoke about it occasionally, and shared rumors when they were bored, but most avoided it. They said the hospital sucked the warmth out of everything around it, and no one wanted to test whether the feeling was real or imagined. But inside the hospital, specifically within its oldest and most reinforced wing, fear was not a rumor. For decades the name Ward C had traveled from one staff member to the next with a kind of quiet shudder, as if simply speaking it aloud made the hallways colder. Ward C was officially labeled the locked rehabilitation ward, reserved only for patients who were unstable, unpredictable, or dangerous enough that even the security team hesitated before stepping inside. It was the ward with reinforced steel doors, blackout windows, and a security system installed twice, once by the hospital and once by a government agency no one talked about. If any part of Ravenscrest deserved the whispers it received, it was Ward C. On a stormy Thursday night, Lila Moreno walked up the long path to the hospital entrance, holding her coat tightly around her. The wind was sharp, almost slicing, and the clouds churned in dark layers above her like something out of a painting that wanted to come alive. She had worked night shifts for 3 years and had grown used to the isolation of walking into a nearly silent building while the rest of the world slept, but that night felt different. It felt heavier. Still, she pushed through the glass doors, clocked in, and greeted the 2 receptionists with her usual warm smile before heading down the hallway. Lila's reputation preceded her in every ward. Patients trusted her, doctors respected her, and security officers often said she had a strange calming effect that made even the most chaotic shifts easier to manage. She didn't see herself that way. She simply believed people were more than their diagnoses, even the ones locked behind reinforced doors. Perhaps that empathy was why she had become the only nurse who could walk into Ward C without a knot forming in her stomach. Her shift began like any other. She checked medication charts, updated notes left by the day team, and made sure the emergency equipment was functioning. Rain hammered against the building with a steady rhythm, and distant thunder cracked through the sky, shaking the window frames. The storm was growing stronger by the minute, but the hospital's aging structure held firm. At around 12:45 a.m., Lila performed her first round of checks in Ward C. The ward smelled like antiseptic and cold air, with the faintest scent of metal from the security doors. There were 7 patients inside that night, all in separate rooms, all removed from the general population due to risk factors or violent outbursts. Some were asleep. Others sat silently, staring at the blank walls as if they expected something to appear on them. And then there was Marcus Hale. Marcus was admitted 9 months earlier, though Lila often felt as if he had been there longer. He was tall, thin, and had the kind of quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller whenever he walked in. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with unsettling clarity. Unlike others who experience hallucinations or paranoia, Marcus always seemed aware of reality, perhaps too aware. His chart described delusions of surveillance, the belief that he was being watched by unseen forces, and repeated claims that he was in danger but not from what they think. Most staff dismissed his words as symptoms of his condition, but Lila sensed there was something different about him. He had a strange calmness, a patience that didn't match the fear described in his file. And he never resisted medication or checkups. He simply followed instructions, studied every detail of his surroundings, and waited. Lila entered his room that night, shining her flashlight toward his bed. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling. His eyes weren't wide with fear or exhaustion, just open, as if he were listening for something in the walls. She asked her usual questions. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything? Do you feel safe? Marcus didn't respond, but that wasn't unusual. She closed the door gently and continued her rounds. By 1:10 a.m., the storm rattled the building harder than before. The lights flickered twice. Lila paused in the hallway, looking up, wondering if the backup generator would be needed. Then, At exactly 1:15 a.m., the entire hospital went dark. The blackout lasted only 4 seconds. 4 seconds of absolute stillness. 4 seconds of nothing but the wind roaring outside and distant mechanical clicks echoing from the locked doors. When the power surged back, the lights buzzed aggressively before stabilizing, and the electronic locks hummed as they rebooted. Lila shook off the chill crawling up her spine. Blackouts happened during storms. This wasn't the first. But something about this one felt too perfect, too synchronized. She walked back toward Marcus's room for her next check. The hallway felt unusually cold. Her footsteps echoed louder than normal, as if the walls were listening. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The bed was neatly made. The restraints were folded in a perfect rectangle on the pillow, the buckles stacked on top of each other as if arranged by someone with meticulous habits. And Marcus was gone. Lila froze, staring at the empty bed. It made no sense. The doors had been locked. The windows were reinforced and bolted from the inside. The blackout was too short for anyone to manually unlock anything, and even if Marcus had somehow escaped the restraints, there was nowhere he could have gone in that short amount of time. She pressed the emergency call button on the wall. It clicked, but nothing happened. Not even a beep. She pressed it again. Still nothing. The panel was dead. For the first time during any shift in Ward C, Lila felt fear creeping into her bones. She stepped back into the hallway and shouted for security. Her voice echoed but felt swallowed by the building. Within minutes, 2 officers rushed toward her, followed by the night physician. They searched every corner of the room, checked the vents, examined the locks, looked for broken tiles, loose screws, anything that suggested an escape route. Nothing was disturbed. The room was untouched, immaculate, untouched in a way that felt staged. They pulled up the security feed, but on the small monitor mounted inside the ward, Marcus's room camera showed nothing but static. The hallway camera was blurry. The feed from the main entrance flickered with horizontal lines. It was as if the entire system had glitched at the exact moment Marcus disappeared. Lila could feel her heartbeat intensifying. She knew what the others were thinking but refused to say. Patients didn't simply vanish. Not from Ward C. Not from Ravenscrest. Not in 4 seconds. When the staff regrouped in the hallway, the storm outside grew louder, shaking the windows violently. A distant alarm chirped briefly before going silent. The night physician ordered a facility-wide search, but even as officers ran through every wing, every corridor, every stairwell, Lila knew something felt wrong. Marcus didn't escape. There were no signs of struggle, hurry, panic, or injury. Instead, everything about the scene felt deliberate, like someone had planned the disappearance in advance. Lila's phone buzzed with a text from a security desk. The message read, "Check the wall in his room again." She hurried back. When she entered the room a second time, she noticed something she had missed before. In the far corner, nearly hidden by a shadow cast from the flickering ceiling light, was a single black smudge. She approached it slowly, shining her flashlight. Her breath caught. The smudge wasn't dirt or damage. It was writing. A single word written carefully in black marker. Gone. The writing wasn't frantic or messy. It was controlled, intentional, and placed exactly where someone would find it only if they looked hard enough. Lila stepped back, chills crawling across her skin. Marcus had been lying still less than an hour ago. Now he had vanished, left behind folded restraints, and written a message on the wall. But the strangest detail was one she noticed only when she examined the marker stroke closely. The ink wasn't dry. Someone had written the message after the blackout. Someone had written it while the hospital was dark. Someone who shouldn't have been able to move freely. Someone who shouldn't have been able to leave at all. And somewhere in the shadows of Ravenscrest Psychiatric Hospital, that someone was still inside. Morning arrived at Ravenscrest Psychiatric Hospital without warmth or relief. The storm had passed, but the heavy clouds still hung above the building like a lid trapping every secret inside. Staff members gathered in small groups, whispering nervously, their eyes drifting toward the hallway leading to Ward C. It didn't take long for the rumors to start spreading, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some said Marcus had squeezed into the ventilation ducts. Others said he had somehow picked the electronic locks during the blackout. A few muttered that he had never been a real patient at all, only someone pretending to be mentally unstable so he could get inside the hospital. But no rumor came close to the truth Lila had witnessed. Marcus hadn't escaped through desperation or chaos. His disappearance had felt calm, precise, and impossible. Someone, had orchestrated it. Dr. Evelyn Sohan attempted to maintain order, though the tension in her voice betrayed how unsettled she was. She was a tall woman with sharp features and a reputation for strict control over the hospital's operations. She didn't tolerate mistakes, and she certainly didn't tolerate panic. After a brief meeting with the ward supervisors, she ordered everyone to resume their shifts as if nothing unusual had happened. The official explanation she provided was that Marcus had likely wandered into an unsecured maintenance area during the blackout. But Lila knew that wasn't true. Every maintenance door required a key card that Marcus never had access to. Every hallway was monitored. Every corner had cameras. There was nowhere for him to wander that hadn't already been searched twice by security. When Lila requested permission to review Marcus's medical file, Dr. Sohan hesitated. Her expression tightened, the muscles around her eyes stiffening just a little too much. "There's nothing in his file that will help you," she said. But Lila stood her ground. She insisted that understanding Marcus better might help them predict where he would go or why he had vanished the way he did. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, Dr. Sohan unlocked the records cabinet and handed Lila a thin beige folder. "Be careful with that," she warned. "His file is sensitive." The folder felt strangely light in Lila's hands, almost empty. She walked to the staff lounge, sat at a small table next to the window, and opened the file. What she found inside made her heart tighten. 2 sheets of paper. Only 2. One was an intake form. Basic information, but most of it blank. No family background. No employment history. No personal contacts. The address listed didn't exist in any part of the town. Even the date of birth was uncertain, written in faint pencil rather than typed like every other patient file. The second page was far more unsettling. It was a short handwritten note that said, "Patient must not leave Ward C under any circumstances. No transfers. No evaluations." The message was signed with a set of initials, LM. The handwriting was neat, the letters crisp, and the date written at the bottom made Lila's chest grow cold. The note was dated nearly 3 years before Marcus was ever admitted to the hospital. She read the date again and again, hoping she had misread it. But the numbers were clear. Whoever wrote the note had done so years before Marcus even set foot inside Ravenscrest. And the initials LM didn't match any doctor currently working in the building. Lila closed the folder and walked quickly to the security desk where Officer Daniel Kerr was stationed. Kerr had worked at Ravenscrest for more than 10 years and was known for volunteering for the night shifts others avoided. He was in his mid-30s, calm under pressure. But the moment he saw the note, his expression changed. His shoulders stiffened and he pulled the file closer as if afraid someone might see it. "That's impossible," Kerr whispered after a long moment. "LM is Dr. Lucas Murrin. He died 5 years ago." Lila blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Died? In the hospital?" Kerr nodded slowly. "Right inside Ward C. It wasn't in the news. The director at the time kept it quiet. Said it was an accident during an evaluation. But no one really believed that. After his death, things in that ward changed. Doors got stricter. Files disappeared. New rules popped up without explanation." Lila tried to piece the details together. A man admitted 9 months earlier had a note in his file written by a doctor who died years before his admission. A doctor who died in the same ward Marcus disappeared from. A doctor whose death was covered up. Before Lila could ask more questions, a voice crackled over the hospital intercom. "All available staff report to Ward C immediately. Patient found." Lila felt a rush of relief, thinking Marcus had been located. But when she and Kerr reached the ward, her relief vanished instantly. Marcus was not there. Instead, the staff had gathered around a single message written in bold black marker across the inside of his empty room wall. The letters were sharp and steady, as if written with confidence, not panic. The message read, "You shouldn't have looked." The room was silent. No one spoke. The message seemed directed at someone. But who? Lila felt her stomach twist. Had Marcus written it? Or someone else? Dr. Sohan arrived a moment later, her expression unreadable, though her eyes were darker than before. She stared at the message, then ordered the staff out of the room. When Lila lingered, the doctor looked at her with a sharpness that felt like a warning. "Nurse Moreno," she said quietly, "I expect you to follow protocol. Do not involve yourself in matters outside your responsibilities. But how could she not? There was too much that didn't make sense. The missing patient, the file that predicted him, the doctor who had written about him before he arrived, the message left behind. Every detail pointed toward something hidden deep within the hospital's past. Later that afternoon, Lila sat alone in the staff lounge, replaying the events in her mind. She opened the file again, reading the note for the 10th time. The handwriting, the date, the initials. She tried to imagine Marcus writing the message on the wall, but it didn't match his behavior. He never seemed frantic or paranoid in a way that would lead him to leave threatening messages. He had been calm. Too calm. She thought of the folded restraints on his bed, the neat arrangement, everything done with precision. Nothing about his disappearance felt like the actions of a frightened man running away. Instead, it felt orchestrated, like a plan he had been waiting to execute. But the message, "You shouldn't have looked," felt directed at someone who had uncovered something forbidden, someone who had seen something they weren't meant to see. Lila felt the words pressing into her mind. Was it meant for her? Or for Kerr? Or for anyone who discovered the truth behind his file? She closed the folder, trying to push down the feeling creeping through her chest. The hospital felt different now. More dangerous. The hallways seemed quieter than usual, the lights dimmer, the shadows longer. As she walked down the corridor toward the administration office, she heard two nurses whispering near the water dispenser. "Did you hear what they found in the old records room?" one asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They said someone tampered with the archive logs last night. Someone with clearance." The other nurse looked confused. But who would do that during a blackout? The first leaned in and said, "Maybe the blackout wasn't an accident. Maybe it was a distraction." Lila walked past them, her heart beating faster. She needed answers. She needed to understand who Marcus really was and why his file was a puzzle filled with missing pieces and ghosts from the hospital's past. As she turned the corner, she saw Officer Kerr leaning against the wall, deep in thought. He straightened up when he noticed her. "We need to talk," he said. "There's something you didn't see in that file." "What?" Lila asked. Kerr looked down the hallway, making sure no one was listening, then pulled out a small card he had found wedged between the folder's back cover and the cardboard backing. It was an old photo, grainy and faded. It showed Dr. Lucas Murrin standing in Ward C, and next to him was a tall, thin man whose face was partially turned away. But even from the incomplete angle, Lila recognized him instantly. Marcus Hale. Her breath caught. This can't be real. This photo looks at least 5 years old. Kerr nodded slowly, his face pale. "That's why I'm scared. Marcus wasn't admitted 9 months ago. He's been here before." Before Lila could respond, a sudden announcement echoed down the hall, this time sounding harsher, more urgent. "Security to the basement. Now." And in that moment, Lila realized that whatever was happening inside Ravenscrest Psychiatric Hospital had only just begun. Secrets were unraveling, and she was already too deep inside them to turn back. The elevator ride to the basement felt longer than usual, as if the hospital itself was slowing down to warn anyone heading below ground. Lila stood beside Officer Kerr, her fingers gripping the railing as the elevator hummed and rattled its way downward. She had never liked the basement. Few staff members ever went there unless they had a reason, and even then they never stayed longer than necessary. The place was cold, dim, and filled with equipment no one used anymore. But tonight there was something else in the air, an unfamiliar heaviness, as though the walls were holding their breath. When the elevator doors slid open, the hallway was already flooded with the echoing sounds of hurried footsteps. Several security guards moved toward an old storage room at the far end. The door stood slightly open, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway like a blade. Kerr motioned for Lila to stay behind him as they approached. Inside the storage room, 2 guards were standing over a large metal cabinet, its drawers pulled open, paper scattered across the floor like a burst of feathers. A flashlight lay on its side, still glowing weakly. The room smelled like dust and something faintly metallic. One guard turned to Kerr and said someone had broken into the old records cabinet, which hadn't been opened in years. The cabinet itself was dented near the lock, but the damage didn't look recent. It looked old, as if someone had attempted to force it open long before tonight. The drawers, however, were a different story. Someone had gone through them with purpose. Kerr knelt near the scattered papers, scanning the labels. Most of the files dated back more than a decade. Staff rosters, transfer logs, evaluation forms from patients long discharged or deceased. Lila stepped closer and picked up a torn piece of paper. It was a patient transfer authorization form, but the name had been ripped off. She lifted another sheet and froze. It was the same handwritten initials she had seen in Marcus's file, LM Dr. Lucas Murrin again. But this time the note was longer. It read, "Subject must remain isolated. Any break in containment will compromise the entire program." And below this, half torn away, she could make out the beginning of a date that appeared nearly 6 years old. She looked at Kerr, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked what program the note referred to. He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted to the far side of the room, where metallic scraping sound echoed from behind a closed maintenance door. The guards stiffened, gripping their flashlights tightly. One reached for his radio but found it dead. The second tried his phone. No signal. The hospital had always been notorious for poor reception, but the basement seemed to swallow signals entirely tonight. The scraping sound grew louder, slow and deliberate, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor or along the metal walls. Kerr motioned for everyone to stay quiet. The room fell into a thick silence, broken only by the slow metallic scrape that seemed to draw closer with each passing second. Finally, the noise stopped. One guard exhaled shakily and stepped toward the maintenance door. He pressed his ear against it for a moment, then pulled the handle. The door creaked loudly, revealing only darkness beyond. He shined his flashlight inside. The beam stretched down a long maintenance tunnel lined with pipes on one side and old wiring on the other. Dust swirled in the air like faint mist. But the tunnel was empty. No movement. No figure. No sign of anything dragged. The guard stepped inside, followed by the second, their flashlights bouncing off the narrow walls as they advanced deeper into the tunnel. Lila felt an uneasy shiver crawl up her spine. Something about the tunnel felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. As if whatever made the scraping sound had been waiting for the guards to open the door, and was now gone. Kerr nudged her gently, urging her to step back from the entrance. When the guards disappeared into the darkness, Kerr closed the door halfway so only a sliver remained open, enough for them to listen but not enough for anything to slip through unnoticed. Minutes passed with only faint echoes from the tunnel. Lila looked again at the scattered papers on the floor, searching for anything that mentioned Marcus directly. She found a folder labeled Project Nightshade, the name written in block letters across the top. The folder was empty, just a label and dust. She asked Kerr if he knew anything about it. His jaw tightened. He said the name sounded familiar, something whispered among long-retired staff members, but that most people avoided mentioning it at all. It was one of those topics buried beneath layers of secrecy, the kind that tied back to events no one wanted to revisit. Suddenly, a distant yell echoed from the maintenance tunnel. It wasn't a cry of pain, but of alarm, shouted once, abruptly cut off. Kerr sprang toward the door, pulling it fully open. The tunnel beyond was darker now, the flashlights of the guards nowhere in sight. Only silence, thick and unnatural, filled the corridor. Kerr called their names, but no answer came. Lila felt her lungs tighten. The hospital was old, but it wasn't a maze. There was nowhere the guards could have gone without being seen. Then something moved in the far end of the tunnel. A flicker of light, the kind that came from a dying flashlight bulb. Kerr stepped forward, but before he could call out again, the flashlight flickered once more and fell to the ground with a metallic clatter. The sound echoed all the way to the basement room. Kerr grabbed Lila's arm and pulled her back. The maintenance door slammed shut with a violent force, as if pushed from the other side. Dust fell from the ceiling. One guard stumbled out of the tunnel entrance a moment later, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with terror. He collapsed to his knees, shaking uncontrollably. Kerr and Lila rushed to him, asking what happened and where the second guard went. But the man couldn't form words. His mouth opened and closed silently, as if the memory of what he had seen had locked itself inside him. He looked at Kerr with eyes overwhelmed not by fear, but confusion, as though whatever occurred in the tunnel didn't make sense even to him. The guard was taken upstairs for medical evaluation, leaving Kerr and Lila alone with the scattered papers and the locked maintenance door. Lila felt her chest tighten again. Something was happening beneath the hospital. Something connected to Marcus, the old files, the doctor who died years ago, and the note warning about containment. Kerr searched the remaining drawers until he found a thin file with a red sticker across the front. The sticker read restricted. He opened the folder and inside was a list of 4 names, all patients admitted between 5 and 7 years ago. Each name was crossed out in thick black ink, except the last one. Hale, Marcus. Lila stared at the list, her heart pounding as a horrifying thought took shape. Marcus hadn't just been admitted earlier than they were told. He was part of something larger, some secret program the hospital had tried to bury. And Dr. Lucas Murrin had known everything before he died inside Ward C. She wondered if Marcus had been transferred out of the program or if he had been its final subject. But the most unsettling question was the one she couldn't shake. If Marcus was part of this secret program years ago, why was he sent back? Why now? Before she could voice the question, Kerr lifted one more sheet from the folder. It was a grainy black and white picture dated 6 years earlier. It showed a row of patients sitting in a common area. Their faces were blurred, either intentionally or due to age. But one figure sat slightly apart from the others, tall and thin, posture straight. Even with the blurred features, Lila recognized the shape immediately. Marcus again. Or someone who looked exactly like him. But the date didn't make sense. He looked the same age as he did now. Not 6 years younger. Not changed at all. Lila felt the air leave her lungs. She remembered the night he disappeared, the calmness in his eyes, the way he watched the walls as if listening for something only he could hear. She thought of the message he left on the wall. You shouldn't have looked. Maybe it wasn't a threat. Maybe it was a warning. The maintenance door rattled suddenly. A low metallic vibration shook the frame, as if something pressed against it from the other side. Kerr stepped back, pulling Lila with him. The humming sound grew louder, vibrating through the floor. Then the noise stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only oppressive silence in its wake. Lila knew then that the search for Marcus Hale was no longer a search for a missing patient. It was something far darker. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He had unlocked something buried beneath the hospital, something the staff had forgotten or had been forced to forget. And whatever he awakened was still moving in the dark. As she and Kerr gathered the scattered papers, Lila made one final realization, the one that chilled her more than anything she found in the file. Marcus didn't disappear because he was lost. He disappeared because he knew exactly where he needed to go. And the basement was only the beginning. The night after Dr. Hale's fall from the stairwell, the entire hospital felt different, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The corridors that usually echoed with the distant sounds of patients muttering or nurses hustling now felt strangely muted, like a thick blanket of silence had settled over everything. Detective Mara Quinn returned to the hospital just after midnight, unable to shake the heavy feeling that something crucial was hiding behind the noise of theories and the chaos of the investigation. The moon hung low outside the windows, casting long pale streaks across the floors, making the hospital look like a place between worlds. Mara's mind kept circling back to Dr. Hale's final moments. She had gone over the reports repeatedly, but nothing aligned. He had left no final note, no explanation for closing off Ward C. He had not been depressed, nor fearful, at least not outwardly. And yet, he had been terrified enough to run. People do not run from something unless it feels close, unless it feels real. She walked toward Ward C again, compelled by an instinct she had learned never to ignore. When she reached the locked doors, she paused. The heavy metal frame seemed darker than before, as though the shadows were clinging to it. She swiped her temporary security card, entered the passcode, and waited. The door clicked open with a reluctant groan. Inside the ward, the air was cold, unnaturally so. It felt like stepping into a freezer. Mara hugged her coat around her and walked down the hallway, her flashlight beam sweeping across the peeling paint and abandoned equipment. It struck her how abruptly the ward appeared to have been shut down. Some of the beds were still unmade, a half-eaten tray of food sat on a cat, and there were the faint outlines where medical machines had once stood. There was no sense of a planned closure. It looked more like evacuation. She stopped at room 109, the room Hale had visited earlier that day. She entered slowly, noticing how the atmosphere shifted the moment she crossed the doorway. Her flashlight flickered, and she tapped it back to life. The bed was stripped bare, and the cabinets had been emptied, yet she felt the undeniable presence of someone who had once occupied the space intensely. It was as if the room itself remembered. Detective Quinn stepped closer to the far wall where faint scratches marred the paint. Tilting her light, she saw that the scratches formed not random markings but a name. Her breath caught as she read it, Nurse Evelyn. The name appeared repeated, carved again and again in shaky handwriting that became progressively harder to read, as though the hand that etched it was weakening. Mara felt a ripple of dread crawl up her arms. She wrote the name in her notebook, whispering it to herself. She had reviewed every employee file, every shift record, every archived note. There had been no Evelyn on staff in the last 20 years. As she left the room, she noticed something in the corner that she had missed before, a small metal object glinting in the beam of her flashlight. She crouched to pick it up. It was an old-fashioned nurse's pin, with a faded crest and the engraved name E. Ward. Mara's pulse quickened. Ward. Could that be the reason the wing was called Ward C? Had it once been named after a nurse? That seemed unlikely but not impossible. Hospitals changed names and dedications all the time. Suddenly, footsteps echoed somewhere deeper inside the ward. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps that seemed too heavy and too rhythmically unnatural to belong to a normal person. Mara stood still, holding her breath. The sound grew louder, closer, but she could not pinpoint the direction. She reached instinctively for a holster, though she had no idea what she would encounter. When she called out, her voice seemed swallowed by the cold air. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt oppressive, suffocating. Mara stepped backward toward the entrance hallway, every nerve on high alert. She didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural forces, but she believed in danger, and whatever was in that ward with her felt dangerous. She exited quickly, locking the doors behind her. Outside the ward, she leaned against the wall, trying to slow her breathing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watched the entire time she was inside. Something about the ward wasn't just abandoned. It was hiding something, or someone. The next morning, Mara met with the hospital administrator, Mr. Phelps, in his office. He appeared more anxious than before, wringing his hands and avoiding eye contact as she placed a nurse's pin on his desk. His face drained of color the moment he saw it. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice thin and cracking at the edges. "In Ward C," Mara replied. "Room 109. Do you know who Evelyn Ward is?" Phelps swallowed hard. "Detective, Ward C has been closed for a reason. There were incidents, complaints, but all records of that era were sealed by the board." "That's not an answer," Mara said sharply. He hesitated before speaking again. "There was a nurse with that name, Evelyn Ward, but she hasn't appeared in any files for a long time because the hospital removed references to her after the scandal." "What scandal?" Phelps leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "It's complicated. Decades ago, Ward C wasn't a general psychiatric wing. It was a long-term isolation ward, used for patients considered too unstable or violent for standard care. Evelyn Ward was assigned there long-term. At first, staff thought she was patient-focused and dedicated. But something changed. Patients claimed she visited their rooms at night, giving them medications they weren't prescribed. Some said she whispered to them, encouraging terrible things. The hospital dismissed these claims at first, believing them to be symptoms of mental illness. But something happened, Mara pressed. 3 patients died under mysterious circumstances in the same week, Phelps whispered, his voice trembling. All had lost contact with Nurse Evelyn. When the investigation began, she disappeared. She never came back to work. The board shut down the ward permanently. But Hale, he paused, shaking his head. Hale insisted that the ward still held something important, something that needed monitoring. "And you let him monitor it alone?" Mara asked. "He insisted on it. He said no one else should be involved. He said Evelyn never left." The room fell silent as Mara tried to process what she had just heard. She felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. Hale had been investigating something that the hospital wanted buried, something connected to a nurse who had vanished decades ago. And now he was dead. After leaving Phelps's office, Mara knew she needed to dig deeper. She went to the hospital archives, a dim basement filled with old records stacked in towering metal shelves. The air smelled of dust and forgotten history. After hours of searching, she found a sealed box labeled Ward C, restricted. Inside were old patient charts, photographs, handwritten reports. The earliest photos of Evelyn showed a smiling young nurse with calm eyes and a neatly pinned uniform. But the later photos showed something different. Her smile had faded, her expression hollowing out into something distant and unsettling. In one picture, taken just weeks before her disappearance, her eyes appeared unnervingly empty. One report in particular caught Mara's attention. It was written by Dr. Hale himself, dated years before his death. In shaky handwriting, he described visiting Ward C at night after hearing voices on the old intercom system. He wrote about seeing a figure in a nurse's uniform standing at the end of the hallway, though he knew the wing had no active staff. When he tried to approach, the figure disappeared into room 109, the same room where Mara had found the scratches. The report ended with a sentence that made Mara's skin crawl. "She is not gone. She is waiting." As Mara read the words, she heard something from behind her. A soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on metal. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. In the far corner of the archive room, a single file cabinet drawer had opened on its own. Inside it, a folder lay pushed to the front, as though placed deliberately for her. She stepped toward it with careful, measured breaths. Inside was a single item, a black and white photograph of room 109, taken years ago. But the detail that froze her blood was the faint outline of a woman in a nurse's uniform reflected in the window, standing behind whoever had taken the photo. And her name badge read E. Ward. Mara put the photograph down, her hands trembling. She didn't believe in spirits, but she knew when she was being warned. Evelyn Ward was not a name written in the wall by a delusional patient. She was real, and she had never left the locked ward. And now Mara understood why Hale had spent his nights guarding the place. He hadn't been protecting the hospital from the ward. He had been protecting the world from what still lived inside it. Everything pointed toward one terrifying conclusion. Evelyn Ward had returned. Or Weiss, she had never left at all. Detective Mara Quinn barely slept after discovering the photograph in the archives. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faint outline of Nurse Evelyn standing in the reflection, her blank expression staring through time. By morning, Mara felt as if she had been awake for days, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Something had been buried inside this hospital for far too long, and Hale had died trying to bring it into the light. She wasn't going to let his death become another mystery stacked on top of the others. Outside, fog clung to the hospital grounds like a shroud. The rising sun struggled to pierce through it, leaving the world dim and muted. Mara walked toward the main entrance, feeling the weight of the upcoming hours pressing down on her. Today she had to confront the truth of Ward C, no matter how dark or unbelievable it might be. The deeper she went into this investigation, the more she felt she was stepping into a story that had been waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to finish it. Inside the hospital, everything was oddly quiet. The nurses worked with lowered voices, their eyes avoiding Mara's. It was clear news of Hale's death had spread, and rumors were already running wild. Some whispered that his fall wasn't an accident. Others claimed Ward C was cursed, and a few murmured that the ghost of a nurse walked the corridors. Mara didn't believe in ghosts, not truly, but she believed in fae. And something inside this hospital had been scaring people for decades. She went first to Hale's office. The door was unlocked, as if the hospital staff had been too afraid to enter after his death. The room smelled faintly of old paper and antiseptic, mixed with a lingering trace of his cologne. The sight of his empty chair made something tighten in her chest. Hale had been trying to tell the world something, and now he was gone. Mara searched through his desk, looking for anything he might have hidden. Among the scattered papers and outdated medical reports, she found a thick notebook wedged behind a stack of binders. It was worn, the edges curled, the pages filled with frantic handwriting. Hale had been documenting everything. His entries grew more desperate with each passing month. One detail repeated over and over: she appears only when the ward is silent. When the lights dim, she stands in doorways first, then closer. Mara read quietly, her breath catching on the words. Hale had been slowly losing his grip on his own peace of mind, not because he was unstable, but because something was hunting him. He described dreams of Evelyn standing over him while he slept, shadows in the corners of his vision, whispers over the intercom even though the system had been disconnected years ago. And then, at the very end, his last entry stood alone beneath the shaking sentence: "I can't keep her in there anymore." Mara closed the notebook, feeling a chill settle through her bones. If Hale believed something had escaped Ward C, then she needed to find it before someone else got hurt. She made her way toward the basement again, But instead of going to the archives, she turned left down a narrow hallway she hadn't noticed before. It led to an older part of the building where the electrical panels and boiler systems were kept. The lights flickered above her as she walked, humming faintly like they were struggling to stay alive. She followed the hallway until she reached a rusted metal door with a small glass window. The sign on it was old, peeling, and barely readable: Ward C, emergency access. Her heart began hammering. There was a second entrance. Inside, the air was stale and freezing. The emergency access corridor led directly into the rear of Ward C, bypassing the main locked doors. She stepped forward, illuminating the space with her flashlight. Dust danced in the beam, swirling slowly like disturbed spirits. She walked down the corridor, each step echoing off the hollow walls, until she entered the ward fully. This time, she didn't feel alone. She could feel eyes on her. Cold, watching, patient. The beds were still empty, the hallway still silent, but the air carried a pressure that made her chest tighten. Something was near. Mara moved carefully toward room 109, her hand resting on the grip of her gun even though she wasn't sure a weapon would help her. Before she reached the room, she heard it. The faint sound of humming. A gentle, lilting tune, like a lullaby sung by someone who had forgotten what comfort was. The sound drifted through the hallway, growing clearer with each step she took. Mara swallowed hard and followed it. When she turned the final corner, she saw the silhouette. A woman stood at the end of the hallway, facing away. Her uniform was unmistakable, an outdated nurse's dress with a crisp apron. Her hair was neatly pinned beneath a white cap. She looked exactly like the photographs. Evelyn Ward. Mara froze, her entire body seized by a shock she could barely comprehend. The humming continued, soft and steady. Mara tried to speak, but her voice came out thin and weak. Evelyn. The woman stopped humming. She tilted her head as if listening to Mara's voice drift through the air. Slowly, she began to turn. But before her face became visible, the overhead lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. Mara fumbled with her flashlight, her breath shaking as she tried to steady her nerves. She raised the light again, and when the beam landed on the end of the hallway, the woman was gone. Only the cold remained. Mara's pulse thundered as she took a step backward. She felt the heavy weight of dread settle deeper than before. Whatever she had seen wasn't a trick of her mind. It was real. Evelyn Ward's presence lingered here, tied to the ward like a stain that refused to fade. Mara forced herself to continue toward room 109, knowing that turning back now would mean she was admitting defeat. And if Evelyn truly wanted her gone, she would have shown her something worse. Inside room 109, Mara immediately noticed something new. The name Nurse Evelyn scratched into the wall had become deeper, as though carved again recently. Fresh, pale marks stood out sharply against the older faded scratches. Someone, or something, had added to them. Mara stepped closer and saw a second message just below the name. She won't leave. Her heart pounded as she read the words again. She knew Hale had been terrified of something. She knew patients had died mysteriously decades ago. But she didn't yet know how Evelyn had become a part of this place so deeply that she could never leave. Behind her, the door creaked. Mara spun around, but no one was there. The corridor was empty, silent. And yet, she felt breath on the back of her neck. Cold. Hollow. She stepped out of the room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She had to finish this. She needed answers. Mara made her way to the nurse's station at the center of the ward, where a dusty file cabinet still stood. She had already searched it during a previous visit, but something told her to look again. Maybe Evelyn herself was guiding her, intentionally or not. Mara yanked the drawer open and began searching through the yellowing folders. Near the back, she found something she hadn't seen before, a sealed envelope marked with Hale's handwriting. Inside was a thin stack of papers and a final message from Hale, written like a confession. She wasn't always what she became. Evelyn Ward was the most dedicated nurse we had, but she grew obsessed with fixing the broken patients. She believed she could cure anyone, even those beyond saving. When patients resisted, she acted alone, adjusting their doses, experimenting with her own mixtures. The deaths were no accident. They were her attempt to correct them. Mara felt sick as she read. When we confronted her, Hale continued, she locked herself inside room 109. By the time we broke in, she was gone. The window was sealed, the vents inaccessible. But the room was freezing, and the bed was soaked in something like frost. Something happened to her in there. Something we still don't understand. Mara turned the page, her hands shaking. She never walked out of Ward C, Hale wrote. But she never died, either. She became a part of this place. A presence that refuses to fade. I have contained her for years, but the walls are weakening. Mara closed her eyes, breathing through the fear twisting inside her. Evelyn wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. She was the lingering echo of madness, guilt, and obsession, a permanent scar on the hospital whose consequences had been ignored for too long. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled. A soft humming flowed through them. Mara spun around, terror gripping her chest. The intercom had been disconnected for years. Yet the lullaby continued, drifting through the speakers with haunting clarity. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. Mara raised her flashlight, her breath unsteady. The silhouette of Nace Evelyn stood there once more, her form half illuminated, half swallowed by darkness. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She simply watched. Mara stepped backward toward the emergency exit. The humming grew louder. The lights dimmed again. She felt the temperature drop sharply, her breath turning white. The shadow began to glide forward, its movement unnatural, silent, drifting rather than walking. Mara ran. She fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing wildly as she reached the emergency door. She yanked it open, her lungs burning with every breath. She raced through the basement hallway and didn't stop until she burst into the main corridor of the hospital. The humming cut off instantly. The silence that followed felt final. Mara didn't return to Ward C after that night. She submitted her findings to the police department and urged the board to seal the ward permanently. Not just with locks, but with concrete and metal barriers. Ward C was closed off completely within days. The doors welded shut, the emergency entrance sealed. No one was allowed inside again. But Mara knew sealing the ward did not erase what lived inside it. Evelyn Ward remained there, frozen in time, trapped within the place that had twisted her into something unrecognizable. Some tragedies never truly end. They echo. They linger. They wait. To this day, hospital staff refuse to walk near the sealed corridor after dark. They claim they hear humming sometimes, faint and distant, like someone comforting a patient who no longer exists. And every now and then, a shadow moves behind the welded metal doors, reminding anyone who passes that the past is never as buried as we hope it is. The locked ward incident may be officially closed, but no one really believes it. And deep within the darkness of Ward C, the nurse who never left waits quietly, humming her lullaby to the empty halls.